Thanks. All right. I'd like to welcome everybody to the October 4th meeting of the Committee to Review and Assess Zoning and Review of the Town's Use of Regulatory Agreements. Start by reading the Mass General Law Statement. This meeting is being recorded and will be rebroadcast on the Town of Barnstable's Government Access Channel in accordance with Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 30, Section 30A, Section 20. The Chair must inquire whether anyone else is recording this meeting, and if so, to please make their presence known. No one here. This meeting will be replayed on Xfinity Channel 8 or High Definition Channel 1072. It may also be accessed via the Government Access Channel live video and in the demand archives on the Town of Barnstable website. I think we'll ask Cynthia to do a roll call.
Committee members: Ken Alsman, Catherine Ledeck, Councilor Charlie Bloom,
Here.
Councilor Kristen Turkelson,
Here.
Councilor John Crow,
Here.
Councilor Matthew Levesque, Councilor Jeff Mendez, Seth Entienne,
Here.
Chair of Committee Bob Schulte.
Here.
You have quorum.
Thank you. Read the purpose of the committee, which is to work with the town's planning and development staff to review and reassess recently adopted zoning changes, review the town's use of regulatory agreements, and make recommendations to the council. I want to thank everyone again for joining us today, both in person and via Zoom. We continue to appreciate the public's interest in the committee and its work. As always, we encourage the public to provide input and comments either in person, via Zoom, or by email. Written comments can be emailed to Cynthia Lovell at Cynthia, CYNTHIA.Lovell, LOVELL, at town.barnstable.ma.us. Cynthia will forward all comments received to all of the committee members. A couple of quick housekeeping items. I really don't have anything other than just to remind everybody that Cynthia has been working with Robin Anderson and the zoning, the building and zoning group to set up any tours of the zoning code compliance program. I think to date she's only got a couple of folks that have signed up. There's a couple of dates that Cynthia has available. So if you're interested in signing up to do a tour, if you could reach out to Cynthia, either talk to her today or send her an email if you'd like to set up an appointment for that. With that, any other comments from the committee members on housekeeping? No? Okay. I think with that, we will move to public comment. Just to remind folks, there'll be a Zoom link. And once the Zoom link is closed, once public comment is over, the Zoom link will be closed. But the meeting can be seen on Channel 8 for the rest of the meeting. So with that, I'll ask first if there's anybody in the room that has any public comment.
Hi, Eric Schwab from Hyannis. I'll be quick. I know you're shorthanded today. I wanted to talk about the downtown zoning and call your attention to the site plan review process. And if you haven't seen it, to specifically look at the approvals for the demolition of the church downtown and some of the concerns expressed by the Independence House about that construction effort. I thought that was a very, very good example of how the citizens of Hyannis are being disenfranchised by developers who are within the boundary of the growth incentive zone. The growth incentive zone has a very stark, uneven definition. And if you're unfortunate enough to be on the other side of that line, you basically have no rights to privacy. They can build 4 stories looking into your backyard. You have no input as to noise, traffic, because the form-based zoning is designed in such a way that if you fit in the box, anything goes. So one thing to think about as you approach form-based zoning is, can you soften the line? So as you approach the border, can you go from 4 to 3 to 2 stories? One suggestion. The other, I think there needs to be some recourse for aggrieved citizens. So in the case of the Independence House, confidentiality is an important factor in their business. You know, people come to them under duress, and they expect a certain degree of confidentiality. But because they're outside of the line, when they raise concerns about fencing and privacy, they were basically told to go pound sand. I mean, they were basically said they have no recourse. And that's a function of the zoning. That's in the zoning. It's how we define the boundaries of the JIS under form-based zoning. So I would ask that you think about the edges and the impact on those of us who live on the edges, and then think about how agreements might be handled. You saw the difficulty I'm having in my own neighborhood with just a couple of trucks parked in front of my house, right? Chair Schulte was kind enough to allow me to copy him on several emails. I spared most of you. But it's very difficult to get resolution from the town. So if you're living in, you know, precinct 8 or 9 and you're bumping up against this new form-based zoning, and suddenly traffic is spilling out into your neighborhood and it's there overnight, there's no one in the town who will address the issue of unauthorized overnight parking on a private road. There's no rules for it. The police don't handle it because it's a private road. And Director Florence went to great lengths this week to exclude himself and his department from zoning enforcement on private roads. As far as he's concerned, if it's not on your property, if it's on a road, regardless of what happens on that road, that does not fall under his auspices. So he is not responsible for zoning enforcement on streets. And that's, frankly, is going to be a problem in Hyannis as we build. I mean, I was observing the Affordable Housing Trust meeting today, and we're pouring millions of dollars into this area, building fairly substantial housing that is effectively ungoverned by zoning. I mean, there's no zoning enforcement in this area, and there's no zoning enforcement on the edges. So again, I know that there's been some discussion about whether or not enforcement is a topic of yours, but think about it. Think about when you look at that 4-story box that's been approved, think about what it's like to live next to that box, and think about who you would call if you had a concern about something spilling out of that box onto your street. I mean, I personally don't have an answer. You know, I would always rely on the decency of humanity, you know, to resolve these issues, but that doesn't always work. So I would appeal to you to consider what you can do as what recommendations you can make to the town council that might be enforceable, that might actually benefit the residents of Hyannis. Thank you very much for your time. I have to run to a birthday party, but I'd like to thank you very much for showing up and making a quorum. We appreciate you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schwab. Anybody else in the room that would like to make a comment?
Larry Moran from Kentuit.
Well, Mr.
I
Moran?
wasn't going to say anything, but I've got a couple of things that because my mind's been circling in a lot of different areas. But the last time, I thought that Brian Florence did a really good job. I've known him for a number of years, and I thought that he came across and presented his position well. I'm going to be interested in the follow-up, and I did give Jim my request that I get his access response from him. I'll hear from him eventually, I guess. The other thing that occurred to me was 810 Wakeby. Is that something you'd considered also? Is that something that had come up?
That's the solar?
Yeah.
Yeah, we did discuss that and discussed at length, and I think the citizens that were involved had reached out to Jim and the Attorney Connolly, so that has been discussed.
You mean discussed after it came up at the hearing, but the meeting before?
I guess it was brought up to us by some of the citizens involved with it, and it was discussed by the committee, and then kind of referred to Jim and to the attorneys to do a little bit more work as to what might be able to be done. So there wasn't much that we could do as a group.
Well, I hope so, because when I was on the Conservation Commission, it was handled extremely poorly. And that, I don't think that's probably not relevant for a decision for you, but if somebody's looking into it, I think that they deserve some representation.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, okay.
Anyone else in the room like to comment? All right. Cynthia, do we have anybody on Zoom?
There is no one on Zoom.
Okay, thank you. All right, then we will close public comment and go to public correspondence. I don't believe we received any public correspondence since our last meeting. No, we have not. Okay, great, thank you. Let's see. Next item on the agenda is item D, but before we go to that, I'd like to quickly discuss item F, which was discuss the request to the town council to extend the sunset date for the committee. I think item F, is again is a discussion to request the extension from beyond the original date of 10/31. We're fast approaching that. And as you know, for a variety of reasons, all the ad hoc committees started much later than they were originally scheduled. I spoke with President Penn this morning, and she said she had no problem with requesting an extension. I looked at the resolve that the council had passed, and it simply requires a request to the town council president to do that. I was going to suggest that we extend it to at least 12/31. I think we've got a fair amount of work to cover. I suspect that with the holidays coming up, we may end up only having one meeting in November and December. So my thought was to request an extension to 12/31 at least, and I guess I wanted to see what the other committee members here feel about that, if that's adequate, if we want to go longer or start with 12/31. We can always request an extension beyond that if necessary. So I'll open it up to see how people feel about requesting the extension. Councilor Turkelson.
Thank you, Bob. I don't remember when we were supposed to originally start and how long the total time should have been. Does 12/31 take us to that full time? Because I think what we should do is honor that total amount of time that was originally set, if that means it goes beyond 12/31. And I'm just thinking because November and December are such busy times that I'd rather extend it further out and then instead of having to redo the same thing over and over.
I think in talking to President Penn, I think it was about a 6 to 8 week extension requiring the recommendations be reviewed by the appointments committee, so it kind of pushed it out about 6 to 8 weeks. So 12/31 would be essentially that two additional months. Again, there's no harm in going longer. If we wrap things up sooner, we can, or if we do 12/31 and find that we need to do an extension, we can always do that. So I think 12/31 would certainly meet the 2 additional months that they got pushed out originally. Any other thoughts, comments? Charlie?
I think we should go a little bit beyond 12/31, maybe to the end of January or even February, because we need to cut it off at some point. But as Kristen said, November, December will probably be pretty busy.
Okay.
And we may not get many meetings in, so to have that extra cushion. But if we get some meetings in and we feel that we're ready to close it, we can close it before
Okay,
the end of February.
thank you. John?
I agree with Charlie. I think it's going to be, we've got a lot on the agenda to continue to do. There are going to be some issues that are going to take a lot of discussion. So I think, and the holidays are going to be busy. So let's give it a good cushion for that. And then we can finish up early if that's good, and we'll be all set.
I think also some of the other committees are still getting going and stuff, so. Seth, any thoughts? Obviously, you came to us late.
No, yeah, I was
I'm
saying
thinking
that-
a little more time would probably be advantageous to you.
Yeah, if it's not like set in concrete, set in stone, we can always extend it. I don't see why we need to worry so much about whether or not we end at the end of the calendar year or extend it to the end of February. So,
Yeah,
in agreement with everyone else.
okay. How do people feel then about extending it to 2/20, how many, 2/28? Is that, we had 28 days in February this next year? We'll ask for an extension to 2/28. Again, if we wrap it up sooner, we wrap it up sooner. Okay. I don't know if we need to take a vote of that, but should we call a vote, Cynthia, of that, of the committee, just to do it?
Raise of a hand.
Yeah, just a raise of the hand. All in favor of extending it to February 28th? Okay. All five, thank you. Let's see, additionally, when I spoke with on this related topic, when I spoke to President Penn, we discussed the zoning presentation given by Mr. Florence last meeting, and I shared with her that there was a lively discussion following this presentation with many ideas and suggestions from the committee on how the zoning enforcement process might be improved and how the town could better educate and interact with the public. When I was appointed to the committee, I can tell you there were two key issues that people repeatedly mentioned to me about discussion purposes, and those were form-based code and zoning enforcement issues. And when it comes to zoning and zoning enforcement, I don't think anyone can plausibly argue that those two are not intricately linked. So after speaking with President Penn, I'd recommend that we have a phase 2 as part of our work, in which the committee will discuss and make recommendations to the town council on zoning enforcement, similar to what we're doing for zoning and for the regulatory agreements. These recommendations might include some of the ideas that were suggested at our last meeting, as well as the possibility of creating a function of separate zoning enforcement group in addition to the building commission. I spent several hours online looking at other towns around the state and the country, and while I see the format that used by Barnstable is common, also common is having those two functions separate, and I think it's certainly something at least worthy of recommendation to the town council to discuss that as a possibility.
I don't see why the body that suggests laws, not laws, but zoning code is also the same body that suggests how it should be enforced. Typically in our government, those two functions are separate.
So you're suggesting that idea of separating those two functions would be a good idea?
Yes.
So, which is, I think, kind of what the topic would be to discuss in the phase 2, how those that might be separated. Obviously, in the last year or so, there's been a lot of responsibility put on we have a building, Mr. Florence is both the building inspector, building commissioner, the inspectional services, zoning enforcement, and now with form-based code, I think he's kind of the point person for reviewing all that. So I think the thought being, we might want to suggest to the town council after discussion that perhaps the zoning enforcement would be a separate group as opposed to being all handled by the same individual. So,
Precisely.
okay. So, my thought is, again, that we do that. I think if folks would agree, my thought would be that, I would discuss with President Penn and Attorney Connolly what, if anything, specific we need to do to make sure that's part of our charge is, phase 2 of our committee. So that would be in the last couple of months of our work. So I guess, again, I'll just ask, it sounds like everybody, any thoughts on that? Anybody agree, disagree, or feel differently? John?
I was under the opinion that when this was formed, this committee, the zoning enforcement, is considered part of zoning. And I never thought twice about that not being the case. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to be on this committee, is that we have a problem with enforcement. It seems that the departments of the town that are responsible for that are a short supply with employees. And I think that's one of the major concerns with our citizens. And I've had this problem myself for years, is getting things enforced that are on the books. So I'm under the impression that it's part of this from the beginning, and I'd certainly like to see us go in that direction.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments, thoughts? Charlie, you agree? I would agree with that, John. I think we just want to make sure, Attorney Connolly has advised us, that we want to confirm that with the charge, and I don't anticipate that being an issue. I think we're all in agreement that we should do that. I think it's in the best interest of the town. You've got a group of individuals who've been involved with this for the last several months, working with planning development and zoning enforcement, so I think it would be logical for us to make any kind of comments and recommendations. Again, they're just recommendations for the council to consider going forward. So I'll reach out to President Penn and Attorney Connolly after this meeting just to make sure we formalize that. So, okay. Thank you. Appreciate that. With that, I think we can move to item D, which was a follow-up discussion on Mr. Florence's zoning enforcement presentation. I think we'll probably hold off on any formal detailed discussion of that until we review that with President Penn and Attorney Connolly. But I thought it might be helpful just to kind of go through, summarize some of the key thoughts and comments that folks made at our last meeting. So I put together a list. Maybe I'll just run through these, and if anyone has any other ones, again, I think we'll follow up with further discussion. This is just kind of a reminder, but I think some of the key topics that were discussed were the importance of education and providing residents with complete and easily accessible information on the zoning enforcement process. Kathy Ledeck mentioned that she had seen in other towns the establishment of a tutorial or primer online, which created and explained the zoning process, how it works to citizens, kind of a step-by-step explanation of how to file an enforcement request, including whatever evidentiary requirements and the time frame to be expected. I know I spent a little time looking at our website and comparing it to some of the ones in other towns. I saw where you can actually go online in other towns and do your zoning enforcement request online. I didn't see anything like that. There wasn't even an explanation. And I think Brian agreed with us, and that's my understanding they are working on some documentation for that. So again, I think that's just something that we'll want to talk about in one of our recommendations. Charlie mentioned the fact that he had heard that I think the enforcement group was looking at the possibility of adding 2 staff, and maybe the thought was they need even more members. So I think, again, more discussion as to maybe something to recommend to the council that they need to relook at the number of folks that are assigned to enforcement. John mentioned that, he requested inspections be conducted outside the normal business hours of 9 to 5 on weekdays. That, as we all realize, many of the violations that occur happen in the evenings and on the weekends. So, some thought, I think Mr. Florence mentioned that some of that is done, but without these appropriate staffing levels, I'm sure it's difficult to get people to go out there at nighttime and on the weekend. So another thing to look at. Kristen requested that there be more and better interaction and communication between some of the departments, zoning, building, assessor departments, concerned that, too often we work in silos and the groups aren't aware of each other, what they're doing. So again, another thought to do that, to recommend to the council. John stressed the importance of the town publicizing and encouraging the use of the citizen resource line. We have a good resource there that could be used. It sounds like it is, but, half the battle is just publicizing and making the public aware that that's out there and how it can be used. So, those are some of the things that, I think we talked about. And I think once we confirm, a phase 2, I think we probably delve into some of those. So I think those are the highlights. If anybody has any other ones they can think of that were discussed after Mr. Florence's presentation, please feel free to toss them out, or maybe send an email to Cynthia that she can send to the group, and we can, include those when we get to that point. Yes, Kristen.
Along the lines of the silo, my only other comment was, is how we communicate being a standardized process. You file a complaint, and we receive the materials, and maybe they're adequate and sufficient, so there needs no more information. It's just letting residents know you have, the party that's received the complaint has X amount of days to respond, and I know there's actually a legitimate process that follows a timeline, and in that timeline, we could call every day of the week, and they're not going to give you any updates. So it's like, can we minimize the burden of people calling every day? Maybe that won't stop them, but I think if people have an understanding of what to expect, then they're not like kind of out in the ethers hoping to hear back. So I think a standardization of the process so that people really have an understanding of what's going on, what will be coming down the road, why haven't I heard anything, so that we can let people be aware of what's going on.
Thank you. I agree with that. I think hopefully, and some of what Brian indicated, and we'll probably learn a little bit more for those of us who do the tour, but in, some of the documentation and maybe putting together something online that establishes the process, that's important to do that as well. So, John.
I just want to throw something out there, Bob. When we're talking about enforcement, we also have, one of the reasons why we have these problems is there's not enough places for contractors to park their vehicles in the town. And I remember President Penn of the town council mentioned that originally that was the locus of where, when we put together Independence Park, was one of the things they want to look for spots to build bays. And since we've been, now this is maybe out of our purview, but I think it's something we ought to maybe note to the council at some point, that should be a priority in building as we're coming forward, not just housing, but about building enough bays or a good amount of bays to have the availability for these people who are working out of their homes, and make it clear that that's their they should be taking advantage of that and move from there. So I'm just thinking that we can put that as a note for consideration to the town council, is working on some kind of a plan for the Independence Park area to go ahead with one of their original charters, was to do that. Thanks.
Thank you. And Jim, I might mention that I know as part of the LCP, and you're beginning to roll out the land use maps for consideration of public input. I think Independence Park is on that, so maybe at the appropriate time you can give us a little insight to that and maybe put that as a note as something that we include in our recommendations to the council. At least some discussion of that. Okay,
I will say that that's an important thing for the growth of our economy here in the town. So that would be a net positive, A, for the neighborhoods and the people dealing with this next door to their homes. And then the contractors have places to grow and increase their business. So it's good for everybody if that's the case. Good for the people living in the neighborhoods who have the problem with this, and good for the contractors. They have a place to do their business that's legitimate in town.
Seth?
Is there current wording in the zoning that creates an obstacle for developers to park anywhere or to do their business in a more community-friendly way?
Jim, I'll defer to you if you have some thoughts on that.
Well, not at this time in terms of Independence Park. I mean, that's industrially zoned. However, to Councilor Crow's point, the area is also zoned for opportunities for things like multifamily housing and others, and so that has given way to those types of uses. Whereas the original charter, to my understanding, I would agree, was originally to focus on those industrial type uses. So those have really been given a back seat recently to uses in that general area, and to Chairman Schulte's point about the LCP. The LCP has identified this, where the committee is actively looking at their future land use map and strategizing what the next 10 years may look like, and identified that as a priority study area to determine, to identify that as a priority area to study, to say, what is the next 10 years of Independence Park? And, we need to really flush out those issues, because absolutely what we've heard here today could be that return to the original intent, and making that a priority, and figuring out maybe how best to incentivize that type of use in that area. Because right now it's allowed, but there's no real, that we haven't seen applications for that use in that location. So we need to figure out, why that is, and how could we maybe incentivize that use in that area, if that's the route the town wishes to take.
That use being industrial use or multifamily housing use?
Well, so the discussion here is talking about bringing contractor bays and other industrial type uses to that general area. The uses that we are seeing applications for are multifamily housing in that area.
Jim, can I ask on that? So within Independence Park, so it's zoned for either one of them. It's not a distinct, here's where the industrial, here's where the housing. So that's part of the issue. Maybe part of the land uses, we designate a part of Independence Park for this industrial use specifically, so you're not having a competing interest. I don't know if that's one of the things that's being talked about or thought, but return a portion of that to its original intent.
Right.
So you could motivate folks to do that, create small contractor bays that allow folks that are parking their trucks and trailers in their neighborhoods to, rent a bay or park over there, so.
Right, exactly. It really is going to take a concentrated review of that area, because you're right, there isn't specific housing here, industrial here. There's actually several overlays in that area. There's actually still a medical use overlay and a sub-medical use overlay on top of an industrial and a light industrial and a mixed use. And so it's a very convoluted area in terms of zoning that really should be fleshed out and really determine the priorities for that location. So I think based on the discussion from the local comprehensive planning committee, that is really one of those top priorities of actions that is likely going to come out of the plan.
Because I would think land tends to end up in its highest and best use, and if you got a developer who says, I can develop multifamily housing, or I can develop a vacant lot with small bays on it, they're going to go for the multifamily housing, if you allow them to pick and choose. But if you really want to, as John said, create an environment where you can benefit the contractors, benefit residential neighborhoods from not having trucks, maybe you need to designate a specific portion for housing, a specific portion for strictly industrial uses, so.
Yep, well said. Yep.
Okay, great, thank you. Yes, Kristen?
Jim, I have a question for you.
I'm just going to bring my stuff up.
You can stay up there because we're going to go right into the form business.
Sounds good.
In your experience in studying other towns and things that have worked and haven't worked, have you seen examples where they have done such a thing, where they've taken land like that and made contractor bays in order to protect the value and the lifestyle of residential neighborhoods, to be having those home-based businesses that are growing beyond, one truck and one trailer, and asking them to move into a certain area? Have you seen other communities that have done that successfully?
Well, I've seen other communities identify a problem such as that and identify the need. So the need here, if in reality the need here is that there is not enough space for contractors' bays, yes, I've absolutely seen towns that said we're going to take a priority in identifying space in our community for industrial uses. It doesn't have to be that type of use. It could be really any use. That, in terms of zoning, if we identify as a town a need, we say, there is a very serious need for this, and we've identified a location that we want to retain that use, we can identify a location in town that is appropriate for that use and zone it. That doesn't mean it's going to come to fruition, though. We can do all our best planning and analysis and identify proper zones to allow for that use, but it still takes the market to bring it to bear. So if ultimately, if we play this scenario out and contractors need contractors' bays, but the market doesn't, their demand isn't high enough to pay for, say, the bays, because I'm sure it's going to be, if there is truly a need for contractors' bays, and we're only giving a handful of spaces out, those are going to be a high priority, much like housing. If we don't have a lot of supply, then the demand's going to be very high for that, and the price is going to go up. So very similar is likely to happen for these types of industrial uses. So it's really not going to be just Barnstable that needs to jump on this. If this is a Cape issue, which it likely is, in terms of, we all need our contractors for whatever uses, and many of them are coming over the bridge, perhaps, or they're in our neighborhoods, perhaps. It's likely going to take more than just one town to make a real dramatic shift. But we can certainly study that and try and get to a solution.
Thank you.
So do you foresee a possibility where if we do go forward with this could be the base bay that could then be used to work on development in other towns on Cape?
Meaning we could be a model for other communities?
A model, but also like a base of operations for development across the Cape.
Oh, well, that is a very valid point in terms of it's not just a Barnstable issue, very likely. I haven't studied the other communities to see if there's similar issues, but I would venture to guess that it's probably so. Yes, I mean, very likely if we zone for industrial, we're not building these bays, we're zoning for industrial, and we're saying this is a use we want to prioritize. An individual that wants to jump on that and say, yes, I'm going to construct industrial bays at this location. It's, again, much like housing. We can't say, okay, but only for Barnstable contractors.
Yes.
So other contractors certainly could take up that opportunity.
Okay. Thank you. John?
Jim, there's an example right where I am in Osterville, where a large area that was a zone for retail and housing was made industrial base. How that happened in the first place is a wonder to me. But it seems like this kind of thing, it should be in an area that's zoned for it. Okay, and I don't believe this was zoned for it. It's there now. So we should be doing housing where housing is zoned and industrial bays where they're zoned at this point. So that's the way the market is going, and there's definitely demand for that. So those are all filled as far as I know right now. So I think this is definitely needed, or to flesh out areas where these are housing is a priority versus industrial. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, John. Any other comments, thoughts? Charlie?
Jim, just a clarification. Are you saying that we can't build something within the town of Barnstable and just keep it at the, with Barnstable businesses?
Well, so we're not builders. The town's not building, contractor bays and then leasing them out. At least I've not seen a template of that. I mean, maybe we could explore that, but we're not good at building property. We're not developers. So we typically are land in the zone of regulatory. So, we would zone an area that says, we want to prioritize contractors' bays. We see a need for it. We've identified this is a priority location. We don't think it's going to be greatly impactful, let's say, in Independence Park in a certain area. And so we're going to say, by right contractors' bays. Come on in. We would love for you to build them. That's where we would be limiting in our regulatory review. I don't know a model where we would then review people's leases to confirm that they're Barnstable contractors or anything like that. But again, I mean, if that's something we want to explore, we can certainly explore that.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, Seth?
Yeah, I don't see why we can't, or what's the downsides of using a mixed-use zoning so that you can let the market decide whether or not it's used for industrial purposes or for multifamily purposes. And if so, in the case that a contractor wants to use those bays in Barnstable for projects outside of Barnstable, does that not create an opportunity to create revenue off that? For the town, at least?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Although I don't know that the town wouldn't get the revenue, it would be the developer of the units. Yeah. Yeah.
A business opportunity,
Yeah.
essentially.
I see what you see. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, I think as we talk a little bit more about that, that'll be an issue that we'll get into a little bit more, how we might look at some of those areas within the Independence Park, so. Okay. If there are any other questions, we'll move to item E, which was the form-based code downtown Hyannis zoning districts, which we took a little bit of a diversion from with last meeting's zoning enforcement presentation. So it looks like Jim has got a presentation for us. Maybe before you get into that, Jim, I'll just do a quick summary. I think some of the things that we talked about last time, and they're probably going to be covered in here, that I think would warrant further discussion as we get into it. We talked about parking ratio means something, building heights, design guidelines, which I know were being discussed recently, requirements for, there would be year-round housing versus STRs, require more affordable housing either by increasing the exclusionary percentage or requirements for the developers. Questions that have been made by comments by the public, has the amount of housing already proposed and permitted under the new zoning met or exceeded what our needs are going to be? So those were some of the key issues that I think we talked about last time. A couple of things I've seen come up in some of the other conversations. There's discussion about the review of the new apartment where the church, the Christian Science Church was. Do the zero setback requirements make sense in some of the areas outside of Main Street? If we have those in some of the neighborhoods, some of the impact that might have on the neighbors. I think one of the things I've heard is, does it make sense to think where the form-based code zoning would be applied? For example, right now we have it throughout the entire district. Would it make sense perhaps to apply that, make an adjustment that will apply to, say, the feeder roads, Barnstable Road and some of the other areas rather than downtown? You'd accomplish the same thing by bringing in some of the housing, improving those areas that we need development, but you'd still be bringing the numbers of people and traffic to downtown by building those areas without changing the historic buildings, so Main Street. So those are just some of the things that, I've heard from people mentioned. So with that, Jim, I'll turn it over to you. You've got a little presentation here for us, so.
Great. I'm happy to hear that review because that's much of what the presentation is. So I'm glad we're on the same page there. So that's great. So yes, thank you for having me. Jim Cover, Director of Planning. Just wanted to review the PowerPoint here that touches on what we talked about a month ago. Just as much of a refresher. I thought maybe I would go through it one time and then we could start back at the beginning and kind of go point by point if that's okay. And then my thought process here is from our discussion, then I'll start developing out that memo, very similar to the regulatory agreement process, so that at a subsequent meeting we could then start beginning to go down the memo if that's okay.
That'd be great.
Excellent. So downtown Hyannis zoning. So it's important to remember that we're talking about a very specific location. So it doesn't apply to anywhere else other than downtown Hyannis and within this boundary. So the boundary is essentially the airport rotary to the Yarmouth Town line, down Ocean Street to Nantucket Street, and then along towards the west to the West End Rotary. There's 7 zoning districts. There's the downtown Main Street, which is the maroon darker color. Downtown Village, which is the purple. It kind of surrounds the downtown Main Street. Those are what you would refer to as form-based zoning. Then we have the hybrid, which is a little less, or a form-based light, if you will, for downtown neighborhood. And downtown neighborhood is in the yellow. And that is really trying to utilize existing properties for upwards to 4 units within an existing structure, and then opportunities for outbuildings behind it. Whereas downtown Main Street and downtown Village is utilizing those properties and then having the limitations of height and in the box. So that's the kind of the difference between the form and the hybrid. Downtown Hospital is just really literally the hospital campus. The Hyannis Harbor is the light blue, and that's just all around the harbor. Did not increase the height in that regard. Transportation Center is exactly that again, the Transportation Center. And Highway Commercial is kind of that orangey color up along 28 and more of your traditional big box. It's not really the form-based as it allows for that setback. It's your typical 70s design with the building in the far back with the large parking area towards the front. So again, the immediate concerns raised that I've seen or we discussed at the last meeting, height of building, design character, and parking ratio are the 3 straight from the zoning that seem to rise to the top in terms of the zoning. I also touch on year-round housing and inclusionary housing towards the end as something that's, while it could impact this, is not necessarily place-based. It could in fact impact the town as a whole. So I've kind of separated that out a little bit. And then lastly, the chairman had asked me for anything that has kind of risen during the administrative process. So I have a few suggestions for discussion as well after this. So first is the height of the building. So the height of the building has a few different standards in the form-based zoning. So it's not just, okay, you build it to 50 feet and call it a day. It has a number of stories. First has the ground story, which most of the time is slightly higher than the above stories. And I'll give you a use table chart here in a moment that highlights kind of how it's all laid out together. So you have a ground story height, an upper story height, and a number of stories that are allowed in each one of these districts. Then in the DMS and downtown Village, you have a potential setback if you are going up the 4 stories. So here's downtown Main Street. And so what you have is 3.5 or 4 stories maximum. And the ground story height is either 10 or 14, depending on the use. So 14 in a commercial gives you a little more clearance, and it's typically for typical building standards, a little bit taller of a ceiling. So there's a little bit more space there. And then the upper story height of 10. And so Each one of these would add to your total maximum height. And then I do highlight what the requirements were in the previous zoning, because that was the discussion was, where are we now, where were we, and what's really the change here. And so in the previous zoning, the maximum height was essentially 42 or 3 stories, not to exceed 46, and 46 was really granted if you had a certain pitch of a roof. So 46 there. I will say for the 4 stories that we've seen recently, the maximum building height, so for instance, 201 Main Street was 55 feet. So it's slightly higher than what the previous zoning would allow. You got, say, 9 feet. And so that's the height requirement. And again, if I can, I'll just run through these and then come back. We talked about design and character. Yes, as the chairman mentioned, there's also design guidelines that are associated, that are somewhat associated with the zoning. It's not zoning. It is regulations and guidelines that other applicable bodies review submissions for. So in the Main Street and Waterfront Historic District, which is Main Street and Ocean Street and the general area around there, the Harbor District and Main Street, there are design guidelines that go above and beyond this zoning, but this zoning starts to develop out this design and character that the previous zoning didn't have at all. So we offer, or we require building components, certain dimensional requirements in the appendix of our zoning code. So whenever there's a cross gable, for instance, the width has to be of a certain size. So these design standards were fleshed out through multiple architects reviewing proper standards and how it would look appropriate given the dimensions required. We also require, if you're going to put dormers, to have a certain dimensional requirements there. So again, for instance, this one is 50% of the roof. If you're going to begin to put dormers, you can't just put one over to the edge there to get yourself one extra unit. It needs to be, proper design features all across the roof line. If you're going to put balconies, we have dimensional requirements and recommend balconies at the upper levels. Same thing with oriel and bay windows. If you're going to put it, we have dimensional requirements to make sure that they are done in a proper manner. And a lot of these, if you don't have these requirements, you tend to see corners being cut. So these are all standards built into our tables for building components in the zoning. The design guidelines that the chairman was referring to takes it a step further and does things like colors and numbers of and materials. Prohibiting vinyl siding, for instance, and really prioritizing things like shingle or clapboard. Touched on the bay and oriel. We also have frontage type. So trying to not permit just flat fronts. So requiring different frontage types. We give options so that, not every frontage type is the same as you go up and down our neighborhoods. So, you have stoops, you have front porches, front gardens, entry plazas, storefronts, dining patios, galleries, common lobbies. So all of these kind of lend itself to the different types of uses that would be promoted or pursued. But it gives them different options. So again, we're not 100% uniform going down the roadway. The third item was parking ratio. So the parking ratio, generally speaking, for residential, 1 space per unit. That's what it is today. It does give numbers for different types of uses. And then that last column there has shared parking adjustment. So if you have commercial on the first floor and residential above, there is some reductions of required commercial space. What was previously required, and I'll just read it verbatim, parking space requirements for residential dwelling units shall be 1 parking space per bedroom for 1 and 2 bedroom units, or a total of 2 parking spaces for units with 2 or more bedrooms. So there was definitely additional parking required in this, obviously. I will say for studio one bedroom, though, it is one space per unit, and anything above would be two, essentially, is how it laid out. It did give opportunities for shared as well through special permit, as well as the current zoning allows for by special permit. And it also did waive parking when there was opportunities for public parking within a certain vicinity. So that's why you see a lot of the commercial units when they're redeveloped or new tenants. Their claim is, there's public parking here, and they didn't need to provide parking at that time. Yeah, absolutely.
Pause a quick question there. So under the new zoning, it would be just one parking, whether it's a 1, 2, or 3 bedroom? It's just one
Correct.
parking space? Okay.
Correct.
Thank you.
And then other challenges that I've noted during applications. So this is the one that we've received a number of requests for relief from, or number, I think 3, maybe 2. One of which just recently passed by the planning board. Mr. Schwab mentioned Independence House. They requested a reduction from this. So what this means is 80% primary build out, meaning as we discussed, the priority is to, if you're going to build longer buildings, they will be along the frontage. This is the 80% minimum, so 80% of your frontage would be built out. There's a whole host of reasons why 80% might be problematic at times. There was an access concern for one property down towards the Yarmouth town line, and so they sought relief from that and received the relief. And so, we looked at it, reviewed it. We talked to the fire department, who agreed that, they would like to see a slightly wider entrance, and the planning board granted the relief. Same thing here, Independence House, nonprofit, didn't want to build more building than they had to. The planning board at least indicated that they were meeting the intent of the zoning and granted the relief. So it's been a smooth process, but it does highlight that maybe 80% might be slightly too much, and we might want to tinker with that dimension. Fenestration percentage. So this is something that I think is maybe a policy question, and so it might be a good discussion to be had with the council. So what this means, again, 60% ground story fenestration in the DMS on primary frontage. What in the world does that mean? So 60% of the first floor has to be windows and doors. That's basically what that means. 6% has to be windows and doors of the area of that first floor along essentially Main Street and Barnstable Road, those 2 stretches. And so if you think that through a little bit more, really what it's trying to highlight is on the first floor, we're prioritizing commercial. So we're prioritizing that commercial use, and we're prioritizing the ability to have a nice walkable area where we can look into these commercial uses. So that's why we're promoting and prioritizing more windows and doors. It's meant to limit those blank spaces, the blank walls. However, I will say for a number of residential uses that have come in, they said, well, we don't want giant windows for our residential uses right on the first floor. And so, again, why I say it's a policy question, maybe that's a good thing. If we are trying to discourage residential on the first floor, then this is providing that service. But if we want to think about potential residential uses, maybe residential uses have a lesser fenestration percentage is all. So that's just something to think about, and we could certainly have more discussion on that. Roof line build out. So this actually goes along to the character, I would say. And something that, I also staffed the Hyannis Main Street Waterfront Historic District Commission, and something that they've really struggled with. We allow for the length of building, and we have a lot of dimensional requirements that do the push and pull of the front facade. So those bay windows you saw, the balconies, et cetera. So really featuring design of that front facade, but the massing, the overall height massing tends to be a straight line because we don't have that same push-pull on the vertical. And so I've heard a lot of our commissioners with that concern, just saying, you know, this massing is just really one straight line if you step back and see that roof line there. So there could be certainly some opportunities there. We touch on it in the design guidelines. You know, that's something that both the Planning Board and the Historic Commission, with my assistants, have been working on some language to prioritize that over a certain distance. You got to either drop it down a floor or raise it a floor. So we're already starting to work on that, but that's certainly something that could come out of this as well. And then tightening the district boundaries. So this is kind of lending to Mr. Schwab's comment as well as President Penn in terms of harmonizing the districts with kind of the uses that are out there. And you know, from what I'm trying to listen closely to, you know, what the general public is saying in terms of what the desire is for developable standards off of Main Street. And so tightening the boundaries to be more specific to those types of uses, I think we could have a more robust conversation about really the downtown village area is what I would suggest we take a look at, the downtown village, and maybe that is either broken up or we're looking at maybe recategorizing that to maybe the downtown neighborhood or something to that effect. So I think that could be a whole meeting in and to itself. But that's something that, you know, in listening to everybody, I think that could be the next step for the districts themselves. And then the two other items that I haven't dove into too much, but we can certainly, again, each one of these is probably their own meeting. Year-round residential restrictions, you know, not wanting to develop these downtown units for just, you know, short-term rental. So both of those kind of are in line with each other. So with that, I could start back at the beginning. Happy to answer any questions, or, you know, I'm happy to come back at a subsequent meeting building on any of these topic items.
First, I just want to say thank you, Jim. That was a great summary, and I think you did catch most of the things that we talked about. So I guess I'll open it up first if anybody has any specific comments, things they want to add, and then maybe we go back and go through the items. John?
Thanks, Bob. Jim, one thing I think that might be advantageous to do is for sighting and stuff and sight lines and stuff, is that if we have the same height throughout, it's going to look like a canyon. But if there's a little bit of difference in maybe not so much height, but maybe the design of the building where you have gables and stuff like that would have a breakup of the eye. I'm afraid, one thing I think a lot of people will be afraid of is just one uniform height with no breakup to the eye on these properties.
Yep.
So, but that would be, you know, something that you have to say, okay, for this site, we want something here versus that site. I don't know if you have a uniform for the whole length of the street to mitigate that possibility.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point, and something that we talked about with the design guidelines in the Historic Commission and Planning Board, and I failed to mention, so thank you. So in terms of the design guidelines that are being discussed, it's not just the building itself, but it's also taking into consideration its neighbors, so it's abutting properties. One of the applications that was proposed to the Historic Commission, the thing that they struggled with was the allowance of something that is a 3 or 4 story building neighboring a 1-story building, for instance, and the dramatic change in that. So working on stepping up from an abutting property, perhaps. And so we're actively working through that language now to consider that. And I would say the same thing for something like 201 Main Street, if you're not familiar with that one. That's the old Cascade that just came down. That was permitted as a 4-story building. That was the first 4-story building permitted. And, you know, the initial reaction was, oh, that's our first 4-story building. But then when you actually go out to the site, it's a 3.5-story building actually right next to it. And it's only about 4 feet shorter than what is proposed at the Cascade. So it's important to keep in context what's all around you. And so I think the Historic Commission is doing a great job with that. And we're trying to understand that and work that into the design guidelines. So that's a great point, and we're actively working through that.
The other thing I've seen throughout a number of different countries is that They have, say, stucco or cement buildings, and they got a high first floor, say with a cafe below, and then they have a overhang that's made out of architectural, like an overhang between the first and second stories, and that sort of sets back the second, third, and fourth stories. I think the stories look the same, but it's set back a little bit above that. You call it an awning, but a permanent awning. It's not an awning, but it's like a cement with, like say you have a thing and then you have the things that hold it up, whatever those are called. They look very attractive, but it also makes the building and the street look more attractive in that respect. And I think it would break up the sight line from the first and second floor, and I think it would still have the same square footage. It's just that they push it out, and it's not it's a permanent overhang. So that's what I was thinking, something maybe to think about for design standards.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe that's a design option or something we offer to the developers. So, any other initial questions for Jim or comments?
Yeah.
Seth, go ahead.
For the fenestration percentage, are there examples where that percentage is based off of the street that abuts the frontage? So that if there is a main street, you have that percentage for fenestration, and then if there is a perpendicular street that's more of a smaller alley, then that has like a different code or a different percentage for that.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I believe the 60% fenestration is actually only in the downtown Main Street. So the other sections that I showed you, the other districts, don't actually have that same 60% fenestration. It's just the Main Street area. And again, I think that was the intent there was really to prioritize commercial.
Yeah, so
use there.
prioritize commercial on that main street, but then if there's a smaller, like one-way street or an alley, then maybe you could have residential on the first floor.
Right. Yeah. So we don't separate it out in terms of zooming into downtown Main Street and saying this alleyway. It's only the primary frontage that it's required on. So technically, yes, if you have a corner lot, let's say, that primary frontage, say let's just call Main Street, has the 60%, but then that side where you have, say, an alley doesn't necessarily need to be 60%. There is a secondary frontage which is for Main Street is 15%, so a much lower threshold. And I'll say for like downtown Village, even the primary frontage is 15%. So it's severely reduced once you leave the downtown Main Street area.
I'll just make a comment, Jim. I'm very encouraged to hear you say that there's some looking at possibly tightening, if that's the right word, of some of the downtown Village, because I do think, as Mr. Schwab commented and others, it's on the margins that we're going to have the conflicts and the issues and stuff with the neighboring neighborhoods and design standards. So I'm happy to hear that, and hopefully this committee, as we learn more, we might make some suggestions as you go into that soften some of those edges and requirements so you don't have those issues where you have four-story buildings going up next to a single-family home or something. So I'm happy to hear that. So, Kristen.
Jim, in the downtown Main Street and the downtown Village, those are both form-based districts. Are they the exact same requirements in those two districts?
No, not exactly, but by and large, they are. I mean, the heights are the same, the parking standards are the same. It's when you get into the things, the nitty-gritty, like the fenestration, for instance, it's a little bit different. But by and large, they are very similar. That next step, the downtown neighborhood, is that step down, that smaller buildings, smaller density, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. John.
James, getting back to the parking, I think the consultant on form-based zoning studied and recommended with 1.3 spaces per unit. Okay, and I know that was dropped down to 1. So I think when it comes down to about parking density, is that I think we're going to have trouble with just one spot. And so we now have trouble already, and it'll probably end up having parking garages somewhere downtown. I don't know if that's what the town expects or is wants, but I think that was that should be, go back and take another look at that, because it really is going to be a problem with parking, I think, and we're going to have a lot of illegal parking and that kind of thing. And also, did you say earlier that the Independence House got a little bit of a relief from that on the border, no setback? Did you say that happened?
That's correct. They did receive relief for the special permit they requested from the planning board to reduce that size, yes.
Okay, so do you know how, it's not up to the lot now, there is a setback, do you know what the setback is between the new 40-unit development and the Independence House?
Well, so they have existing structures. They've actually added another structure. So that it's not the setback that they were concerned about on their site. They were looking at the building length. So they've reduced their building length slightly. The building next door, or the property next door, was looking to, or has requested to develop a site. I don't recall, I believe it's 6 feet or no, excuse me, 4-point-something feet is the deck from the property line for that. It is 0 setback in the downtown village. So that's certainly something, again, when we talk about the boundaries and tightening the boundaries of districts, that's certainly something we should and could consider. I would say, in terms of that one specifically, there was public comment that, concerns on privacy. And through that process, the developer did state that they will build a privacy fence for them. So that was a positive outcome of public comment, I would say. But understood in terms of concerns on setback. The previous setback was 10 feet, so we're talking about a 6-foot difference there. And so, yeah, that's the existing of those two. They're both developing at the same time.
Was Independence House satisfied with that outcome, or do you know if they were?
I'm not certain.
Yeah, because I think since it's a battered women's shelter, I think that's something that is a concern that we should be taken very seriously about
understood.
their privacy in there.
Yeah,
Okay,
understood.
thanks.
John, I think, just to clarify, if I'm not mistaken, Jim, I think Independence House has its own project, separate from what was, and I think that was where they received the relief on the 80%. So it was something that Independence House was building separately. So two different issues, so, okay. Any other thoughts? Okay, Jim, maybe maybe it makes sense to go back quickly over each of those items. We can talk a little bit. I think what I'll ask the committee to do is, as you go through these, give some thought to this, because I think at our next meeting, what we'll want to do is maybe discuss this. Again, I don't know that we'll actually make a specific recommendation. I'll throw parking out, for example. We're not going to say you need to do this, but I think what our thought is going to be, at least in my thought, is that we will tell the council we think that the parking should be revisited with an increase or something like that. So give some thought to some of these things that Jim's talking about. In our next meeting, we can go into these more detail individually and talk about what our thoughts are, what we might want to make in the way of recommendations that Jim can then document in the memo. So,
Absolutely.
make sense? Okay.
Yep.
Does that? Go ahead, sir.
Do you want us to comment now as we go through each slide?
Sure, if you'd
Oh,
like to
okay.
do, but I
All
think once we get the full, or closer to a full committee
Yeah.
in our next meeting, we can go into more detail, so.
Yeah.
But sure.
Okay, excellent. So to start with height, so we are now in the downtown Main Street and Village, 3.5 and 4 stories. Again, with those specific height requirements in each floor. The previous iteration was not to exceed 3 stories and, again, up to 46 feet in height.
I'll make a comment. So Jim, when you and I met a while back, we talked a little bit about it, that you were finding that some of the applications that are coming forward are actually at three stories. That, while a lot of the developers kind of pushed and felt like they needed 4 to make it a financially worthwhile to build, the reality is perhaps 3 is going to be sufficient. So, and I'm just asking a question. So one of the possibilities might be, we recommend that, obviously there's some things that have been proposed or permitted. We can't change, the town can't change those now, but there could be an update to the form-based code for these districts to say, going forward, we're going to require 3 feet, or 3 stories. Is that a correct statement?
You certainly could, yes.
Okay.
And yes, there has been applications that are 3 stories. Yes.
Okay, so that's a possibility going forward as we talk about this some more. We might want to make that kind of a recommendation. or extending that when you go out to some of the downtown village, the area outside. Maybe right now, as you said, Kristen, right now it's 4-story in both of those. Maybe we say we want 3 in the downtown Main Street, and maybe it goes down to, 3 to 2 as you get closer to the edges. I mean, those are I'm just throwing out possibilities that as we get into this, those might be things that we suggest the council to look at. So if I may say anything wrong, Jim, or it's incorrect, please let me know, so.
Bob,
Charlie, sorry, go ahead.
I like that idea.
Okay. Kristen?
So we have the recommendation here is that commercial is 14 and the residential's 10. And if a project came forward that was all 4 stories would be residential, in your estimation, would they want the first floor to be 10, 10, 10, and 10? The 14 feet is recommended probably because of commercial, we want a higher height. But do you think most builders or developers who would be doing 4 stories of residential would want that first floor to be equal rather than 14 feet if it's going to be used for a residential purpose? I'm not
That's
making
probably a
myself
good
clear.
question for the developers when we bring them in. I'm not certain. I would say that the ones that we have received have been higher on the first floor. I don't think they've gone up to the, no, they have actually, yeah, 14 minimum. Actually, they've actually met exactly the 14 minimum for commercial, and then the 10s moving forward beyond that. So, yeah, I would say for the applications we received for commercial, they've done the 14-foot, and residential above has been 10, yes.
Yeah, I'm not making myself clear. If I was a developer and I was going to come in and I said, Jim, I want to build 4 stories of residential,
Yep.
would it be advantageous to say we want it to be 10, 10, 10, and 10 as a requirement? The only way we're going to give you that extra 4 feet is if it's a commercial application.
I see. I mean, you could. What would be the benefit of that for?
Well, then everybody's complaint about the buildings being too high. I mean, I know it's probably only 4 feet, but it's,
see.
on the same hand, we could say, well, why are we giving the commercial people an extra 4 feet to begin with? I
Yeah.
guess you could make that argument on either side of the coin, but.
I see what you're saying there. Yeah, I would have to give that some thought
Yeah.
at the ramifications of that. And give some thought.
John?
In that vein, are we encouraging the commercial on every building or not? And why would we or wouldn't we?
Yep. So as of right now, the requirement is from Ocean Street to C Street on Main Street is required commercial on the first floor. That actually is lifted from the previous zoning, the 2005 zoning for downtown. It's not required on the first floor elsewhere outside of that stretch. The thought process behind that is, one, we have a mile-long Main Street, and if you go to many other New England Main Streets, I venture to find, I ask you to take a look at them and see what's on either bookend of that Main Street. I guarantee you're going to find some form of housing. Might not be multifamily housing, but it's going to be housing kind of ending those, because you don't want to force the market to develop out commercial, because what you're going to find is once you extend that too far, you're going to have vacancies, and then you're going to have uses you may not want. So especially since I'm not going to identify certain uses, but we have a medical services area very close, so there could be those types of uses in our vacant commercial first floors if we extend that too far. That's my opinion based on my professional review over time. So I would say we could certainly move that boundary from ocean to sea, but I would recommend we be careful about how far we extend that.
By the mile-long Main Street, you're considering that extremely long
It's a very long
for
Main
that.
Street.
And at this point, what is the vacancy rate along that mile for commercial?
Right now, I would say we're not too high on. I don't have the exact numbers. I would say we're doing pretty well for ourselves.
Okay.
As of right now, no, oh, we had a property owner here that could probably speak to that better. But again, we're looking to bring in some of the developers, and they could certainly answer some of those questions for you.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks.
Bob, I just want to say I like the idea that we're maybe protecting kind of the edges, that we're not overbuilding really tall buildings, because I can imagine if you have, you know, a 1 or 2 story areas in a neighborhood, and then all of a sudden you put a 4-story, it's kind of this mishmash. It really kind of pushes out the residents who've been there for 50-plus years in an effort to, you know, make more housing, which I understand we need more housing, but it's also, it's potentially at the detriment of those who've been invested in the community for many years. So I like the idea that we maybe kind of take a look at that and see how that works more effectively to protect our current residents.
Thank you.
Going into design and character, you know, this is kind of a little all over the place, so feel free to chime in on any part of it. But really what it goes into is just, you know, highlighting the fact that we're not looking for simple rectangle boxes. We want different components, different features. We do see applicants and architects taking that serious. Taking that next step has been a bit of a challenge. But when we identify them here, we have seen a lot of things like cross gables being promoted, dormers being applied for, actually balconies being added to, you know, bay windows, et cetera, all in there. To your guys' point in terms of frontage types, certainly can think about a little bit more in terms of maybe a couple different options here. Could certainly work on that.
I'll just make one comment. I'm not sure if it's specific to that, but I think Kathy Ledeck mentioned it last time. I thought it was an interesting comment, you know, how the public spaces relate to the commercial and private. One of the drawbacks in my mind of having the 0 setback is if you have all the buildings lined up right against the sidewalks, you really take away the character if you have some setbacks. And I see here, for example, building component 1 with a front garden, something like that. If one building set back 15 feet and you have a garden area, or if we have seating areas along Main Street somehow, how we incorporate that. But I like that thought of not having every building built right out to the sidewalk. And along those lines with some of the designs and the gables, your comment about getting away from having just strictly a roof line that's one long line, having, you know, setbacks or, you know, reductions. And that goes to some of what you were talking about, John, some of the other designs. How we can encourage, you know, the thought process for some of the changes to include some of those, I think that would be great too.
Like a simple thing that I've seen on a lot of buildings, you have the front facade, but when you come to the main door, they cut at angles and have the door set back into that angle. So you walk, basically, the front of the building, you walk into the building before you hit the front door. Right. And that actually makes it a lot more attractive, and it cuts the big box down to something that's more reasonable for pedestrians.
I was just going to say, I haven't got a chance to go through all the uniform design guidelines, but from what I've seen so far, you're encouraged by that. What is the status of that, Jim? I know that the planning department, they signed off on it, Hyannis Main Street. There was some discussion. They had a joint meeting recently. I haven't had a chance to watch it. Where does that stand?
So it's still active. The planning board did adopt a version of the uniform design guidelines this past December. They met with the Historic Commission this last Monday, and we had a really good conversation. It's 78 pages. They agreed on 77 pages. We're down to 1 page.
Sounds like unanimous to me.
So they continued the matter to work through the last page, and hopefully we'll have consensus here pretty soon.
Great.
So the third item is parking ratio. As I mentioned, right now, 1 space per unit for residential, with, you know, other uses that have differing ratios, and there's shared parking adjustments, and there's a special permit allowance if you want to seek a reduction. Though, you know, from an administrative standpoint, we state that, you know, it's a fairly, it's a new ordinance. We would expect, the expectation would be you would meet the ordinance. But the previous parking requirement, again, was 1 parking space per bedroom for 1 and 2 bedrooms, or 2 parking spaces for units of 2 or more bedrooms.
Just curious, sorry, go ahead, Kristen, go ahead. I just said, just curious, on any of the applications you've had so far, have you had anybody request a reduction from the 1?
We've only had one application request a reduction, and that was because it was a redevelopment of a building that never had parking to begin with. It was an office building that was literally, the property line is the building. And so historically, for the last 70 years, they've parked their employees in the North Street lot, and they had 30 employees, and they were requesting, I think it was 7 units, and they were requesting 1 parking space per unit. And the planning board granted that request. It still has to work through asset management, though. So they can grant that relief, but if it's using public spaces, it's ultimately up to the town administration to sign off on that.
Okay, thank you. Kristen, did you have some?
I'm feeling really dumb today. I'm looking at this chart. I have no idea what I'm looking at.
So I can walk through it. So yeah, I mean, it's a lot of stuff that, you know, it's your first time looking at it. So the columns above with the colors, those correlate to the districts. All right. The use categories on the left side, so it's much like a zoning use chart. So commercial services, so these are general buckets. So if you have commercial services use, here's your going left to right. Here are your parking spaces required for the use per 1,000 square feet. So if you have 1,000 square feet of commercial services use in the downtown village, you're required to provide 4 parking spaces for that. So if you go commercial spaces to downtown village, the purple to commercial, that's 4 parking spaces. And you can continue down the line. So if you have a commercial services, you have cultural services, say you have a multi-tenant building, you know, you have 3,000 square feet, 2,000 of it is commercial services, 1,000 is cultural services. You're ultimately required to provide the 12 parking spaces, 4 plus 4 plus 4. Again, food and beverages service, so restaurants, hospitals, office space, residential, retail sales, and visitor accommodation, so hotels. So those are the uses. On the right side, it gives you a little more specificity. I can't read it from here, but I actually have it in here. I can look it up. But on-site shared parking adjustments. So there's some reduction of parking if, again, you're sharing, say, commercial services on the first floor with residential above. There's reductions of parking allowed for, say, the commercial services. And so, yeah, so that's the chart there.
So I guess why I didn't get it was under commercial services, cultural services, food and beverage services, and retail sales in the downtown Main Street. Is that DMS, correct?
Correct.
You have 0 requirements.
That's right.
Is that because you're just assuming the on-street parking in whatever lots are behind Main Street will be enough parking for those types of businesses?
That's correct, because
Yeah.
Main Street's built out for the most part, and it's about redevelopment of the area, really, and the Main Street. And in the previous parking, you'll see that's the same deal, essentially. If you're, say, filling a space on Main Street, you were a restaurant, you're coming into, you know, you're a barber now. We're not going to make you tear down the building and build a smaller building with 2 parking spaces. We're going to say, well, this building's always used North Street parking lot. And so that's why the requirement is 0.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So, Jim, just so I think I understand that. So if I was looking at just the downtown Main Street, if you were changing from what was done before to what we see here now, probably the only change was the residential or artist. That went down to 1 from whatever it was before. The rest of those are probably the same as they were under the previous zoning?
I could confirm that, but by and large,
Generally.
I would say that's fairly
Anyway,
accurate,
the
yes,
commercial
generally.
services, culture, those would have all been 0 before because the assumption is street parking and back parking.
That's
So
correct.
The real significant change there would have been the residential. Okay. Thank you.
I guess I'm going to make the argument that I still think that the big complaint is, with as many units as we might be putting in some of the buildings, or potentially that could be there, that there's just not enough parking. And I know the goal is to make it a walkable Main Street. And, maybe I'm just at an age where I can't see that, and that's just not something I lived abroad, and I never owned a car till I was 29, and I would love to give up my car today if I didn't ever think I needed to go anywhere again, but it's just not likely. But I think that's still my discomfort with some of those things is the parking requirements.
Is it possible then to look at scenarios where, depending on the use, what does it look like for residential or business if we up the parking requirement versus lowering the parking requirement? Because if I'm not mistaken, at least for residential, when you make a developer put a minimum amount of parking per resident, those costs of taking away lot space that could have been used for a unit now is space for a parked vehicle. That cost for that loss in revenue then gets passed on to the rental to the tenant. So it's a balancing act that I think that we need to reconsider and look at different situations that play out. And on top of that, even if, for example, there was no parking requirement for a business or a housing development, the tenants that would be then moving in, if they are not allowed to have a vehicle, then you're kind of already creating your tenant pool. You're not going to attract someone that's going to live there that needs a vehicle. They're going to look for somewhere else where the market would supply that housing for that person.
I guess the question is, if you're going to build 120 units and you don't have any parking, are you going to have enough people that can literally, in this environment with our current conditions, live there, work there, walk there, get to the grocery store, get to medical center? I mean, it's still, I sound old school. I do actually agree with what you're saying. I went to Reading, Pennsylvania a couple weekends ago. I'm a suburban person here, and literally you had to pay to park everywhere you went, but there was tons of parking. We don't really have that option here, there's, I just feel like there's still maybe not enough parking. Even if we just said, well, you're not allowed to bring your cars, there's still going to be people that own a car and want to park a car, or I don't know where they would park their car in a lot. I mean, it's kind of like the contractor base. We then would say, Seth, you can live here, you own a car because you're a person who's mobile on some level. Maybe you don't need it all the time, but you want to be able to get around or go visit friends or whatever, and you own a car. Where are you going to park your car? Then you're going to pay parking, long-term parking to own a car and park your car. The question is where would we put those parking lots and those parking spaces? I don't disagree with what you're saying at all. I just wonder how the market would really, who would be moving into apartments in 120 of them with no cars? Those
Just
people
real
might
quick,
exist.
To be fair, to clarify, it would be 120 cars, it just simply wouldn't be 240 cars, right?
No, actually, it would probably even be more than 120 people, because, if they're one bedrooms, maybe there's only one person, maybe there's two people living in a one bedroom, or if they're a two bedroom, you might have 4 people living there that all don't own cars. It's very mixed. I get what you're saying. It's an interesting, thought. It's who would be living there? But my question is who will be living there? There's not a grocery store. There's not real great public transport. Maybe work-at-home people. There's definitely more work-at-home people, so, and I guess we're going to have the experiments, so we're going to get to experience it.
Charlie, go ahead.
I think at some point we need to take a look at, what space we have available here. We are hemmed in on all sides. And if we keep going in the way you're suggesting, we're going to need to build parking garages. And isn't that lovely? Isn't that characteristic of Cape Cod and the village of Hyannis to have parking garages? Well, I know we're going to have one right here at Town Hall. And, when do we say enough is enough, you know? There's just everything is getting crammed into limited space.
Thanks, Charlie. I think I'll make one comment. Just you mentioned the word balance, Seth. I think that is clearly important. And I don't know if I understand it correctly, but I know, Jim, when you and I spoke a little bit, I think immediately the mind jumps to, well, if you're going to have 2 bedrooms, you have to have 2 parking spots or 3. And I think the reality, and again, it's hard for me to get my head around it, but it might be an incremental adjustment to that one that addresses the issue. So it may not be necessarily have to have 2 or 3, but maybe it's 1.3 or 1.5. I don't know how that all pencils out when you do the development, but I think that's probably a little more complicated issue than at least I'm able to understand. But I think that's the kind of adjustment that I was thinking, we might be looking at recommending. And Jim, if you can shed any light on that, help us understand how that all works. I'm not sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So we could certainly consider, incremental adjustments. Completely hear you in terms of the option of 1 space per unit. I will say most of the units that we are seeing end up being, as of right now at least, studios and 1 bedroom. So really, it's the same as the previous zoning. That hasn't changed. But, incremental adjustments, because we're not talking about no cars. If people are coming into a new development and say there's 2 bedrooms, maybe they're sharing a car at this point because they have to, because they only have 1 parking space. But if we're talking about incremental adjustments, it does sound weird. You're talking about 1.25 spaces, let's say. How does that even work? So it would just round up, practically speaking. So if, they put 4, they provided 4 units, and it's 1.25 per unit, I mean, we're talking 5 spaces at that point, right? I did the math. So that could be an incremental change. So now we're adding an additional space every couple of units, as opposed to what Seth is mentioning, really developing out to be more of a parking lot with a house on it, as opposed to a building with parking on it. That could certainly be, again, that next step. So we can certainly take a look at what options we have and provide some suggestions for you. I do want to mention, though, too, there's like 2 discussions about parking really happening here. And so the discussion of the parking ratio and future development, or what has been permitted and what could be permitted, is one thing, and about new vehicles coming online in the area and making sure we right-size private development for that. And then there's public parking that exists today, and maybe if they are impacted by new development, perhaps. I will say the public parking we have today is too much. I know it's going to sound weird to you guys, but we got too much parking in downtown Hyannis right now. At the end of July, early August, I take walks up and down Main Street. I take walks up and down South Street. I have my reservations at Columbo's every so often. And I park at South Street parking lot. No one knows where South Street parking lot is. We have a wayfinding problem. We have a directional problem to our parking lots. I was the only car in South Street when I came back picking up my kids. We went and parked at South Street, and we walked to Paleo's Pizza. Only car there. Behind Toomey's, over there, always spaces available. We have, and this is prime. This is July, beautiful Friday, Saturday nights. I know for those that don't reside in downtown Hyannis, it's a different experience. It's like kind of going to the mall and you park at you want to go to Best Buy, but you got to park at Macy's. You're going to have to do a walk. But that's really what we're trying to do here. We're trying to make you walk Main Street and enjoy all the different options we have on Main Street. And I will say, after tonight's meeting, take a walk. You're going to count more empty spaces than you have filled spaces. It really does dishearten me to see all this paved surface on Main Street 10, 11 months out of the year. But that's existing conditions. That's a different discussion than what could happen. So I think that's a real conversation we need to have in terms of ratios to make sure that we don't overburden that public parking. I completely agree with you there, but I just wanted to highlight those two different discussions there. And again, I'll certainly, provide some options for consideration for parking ratios.
Okay. John, go ahead.
Yeah, taking that into account, I think that's because we don't have as many residential properties downtown. At this point, they'll be permanently parking all day, all night. And I think once we put all these in, then we'll lose a lot of spaces. I think as far as how many parking spaces per bedroom or per unit, whatever, it also needs to take in the demographics now we have. It seems like all these overcrowded houses are young adults or, working in the trades or whatever they are. I don't think, and I don't know, I think we've had a lowering of the amount of children going to school here in the last 10 or 15 years. So we got to be counting on what the demographics would be going to these two-bedroom apartments, say, for example. Would they be 4 adults instead of 2 adults and children? And I think it's more likely that'll be the case from what I've seen on the street. So that'll affect the parking, obviously, because, obviously children aren't driving cars. So.
Kristen?
I do have a friend who works on Main Street at Solstice Spa, and she usually has to come to work early in order to get a parking space.
They got 20 parking permits from us.
I don't know if she has one of those or not, but would somebody who, let's say we're building 307 Main and we now have 120 units and we have 150 cars, so there's only 120 parking spaces, so we have 30 extra cars. Where will those 30 extra cars go? 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. What are their, because I literally don't know, because I obviously don't live here. What are the options for the second car owner of a unit to be able to put their car where they're not ticketed, they're not towed, they're not breaking some law or taking up somebody's commercial space where it says, please no parking, parking for Columbus only, or those kinds of situations? Can you, because I literally don't know, so I'm literally asking the question based on what you told me, because I believe what you're saying, so.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So right now, if I had an extra car and I don't have a place to put it, I have to pay for a spot. I have to pay for a spot at all of these very expensive private parking areas. That's your one option for overnight parking. You can also potentially reach out to the town in terms of permits. We do issue permits for businesses. We issue permits for Sturgis High School. They're not overnight parking though. So we prohibit overnight parking. So when we're talking about enforcement, that could be an impact from new development if we need to increase enforcement because of too many cars that are sitting there overnight. Those are your options. That's it at the moment. There could be something that comes from, if there truly is a ton of cars that need spots, there could be a market demand for that somewhere. But right now, we don't have that.
Well, we know that historically, like Stu Bornstein owns the Cape Cod Times building, correct? And he uses some parking next door, I think, and so I guess
That's a good point.
I'm wondering, I mean, he must have an agreement with somebody. Maybe there are other places along Main Street. I guess what I'd like to see is to get a total assessment of literally, like, what are our parking resources around the areas? If there isn't already a system in place, do we need to develop a system that allows this potential problem that we all think is going to happen? Maybe it never happens, but maybe we need to have a plan in case it happens, because if all of a sudden, instead of 30 extra cars, we have 60 extra cars and we don't have anywhere that they can legally park them overnight, I mean, I guess I'm just trying to really understand what would my life be like if I owned a car and I moved here and that was the only place I could move to because housing is such a shortage here and I can afford it and I want to be on Main Street because it's walkable, but I have this car because I need it because I work and I blah, blah, all those excuses. Like, what, if we think there's a problem, what is the solution? So instead of being reactionary, maybe we need to start thinking, we have all these lots, maybe we have a pay to park. I mean, like I said, I went to Reading, Pennsylvania, and it was like you walked up to the thing and you used your phone. There was like 5 different ways to pay. You could use your phone, you could go online, you could put your money in. I mean, it couldn't have been easier in that way. And I know we have those down at the Main Street area. But do we need to think about all of these areas? If there is so much parking and it is owned by the town, is this a commodity that we should be saying, we need to have 150 spaces that are permitted out, and we have stickers, and we have a thing, and we, what are all the machinations of that? So I think that's something that we should be thinking about.
Yeah, we certainly can provide you that information. Our parking manager does do that on a regular basis and has the stats in terms of what permits we hand out and the spaces we have available. Available in that they are spaces, but we're not actively, marketing, say, hey, come rent from us or anything of that nature.
But I guess that's what I'm saying, is like, I'm standing here totally making up a bunch of BS that I think there's a parking problem, and you're telling me there's not, and you probably actually know more than me, so I'm willing to totally be the novice in this conversation. I guess what I'm saying is maybe we actually need to know what are the literal processes that the town has in place to anticipate a potential problem, because we've allowed a zoning change that's reduced the number of parking spaces needed. So we have these X amount of lots with X amount of spaces, and we have a system of, I don't know how many people even know that you can get a parking permit from the town, and in overnight parking, is that allowed or not? I'm still feel like it's very nondescript and not tangible. Like if I walked in and said, I'm going to move here and I'm going to have 2 cars and what can I do? I'm hoping you could make that really easy for me to figure that out. Maybe we need to figure that out.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I absolutely can provide some information and clarify that.
I have to agree with Kristen. I think parking is the tail that wags the dog here about what we can build, is how many places we have to park. And if we have that quantified, so therefore, whatever comes near, then you've got this amount of spots you're available to you, and your amount of units should reflect that. Because I think it's going to be a real problem in the future if we go too far down this road, permit too much stuff. Not that we need all this stuff, but I'm just saying that we should know what we're getting into before we get into it. We shouldn't permit something not realizing that that's going to cause 30, 40 extra cars somewhere that need to be parked and people don't have the space for it. So we should know that beforehand. And I think that'll solve the problem. We can say, okay, you can build this building, you got this amount of units, but that's what you have for parking, so adjust accordingly.
Charlie, go ahead.
I think, Jim, you probably know that I agree with Kristen and John. I used to work at my cousin's parking lot right next to the Black Cat. And he had cars for people that lived on the islands. He had spaces for them. And all of them, were very unhappy about having to walk through the rain and the snow from, right across the street. I mean, it's really not very far, from the High Line to the Black Cat. And there were a lot of choice comments and that sort of thing made. But so I think that, when you talk about, parking at Macy's for Best Buy, I mean, that's certainly something that's happened to me plenty of times. But it only happens, once every 3 months maybe, But if you're doing it every day, it gets old. It really does get old, walking through the rain and the snow and everything to, half a mile to a parking lot, because although we do have plenty of parking, it's not always in the right place, and so, and another thing that I'll just finish with just saying, just because we have a studio apartment with 1 bedroom doesn't mean there's just going to be 1 person living there. Especially, it depends on the cost of rent in these places. I mean, somebody may have to have somebody else living with them. And hopefully they're in love with each other, but they may each have a car.
Kristen?
I just want to make myself clear. I'm not trying to say that, I'm not sure if I'm misunderstanding John. I just want to make sure I'm making my point clear. I'm not saying I think we should limit one bedroom to one car, so that would, I'm actually saying if we are making it, as we're saying here, as one bedroom per unit, is that let's have a clear path for people to be able, if there's two cars, that they be able to purchase a parking pass, have good, stable, legal parking that is enforceable, permittable, and is understood, because I think that, again, we're trying to bring the two ends of the spectrum together. We have people like me who are complaining it's not enough parking, and people on the other hand who are saying it's perfectly adequate, because we might have somebody who has no car living there. But it's like, what is, in either scenario, what is the solution to that? Permittable, safe, known, quantifiable, process-oriented, pay to park, buy a permit, whatever that is, so that we all can coexist in this environment together. Because, we are going to get the housing, it's here, and that's going to fill a need in some way. We just need to make sure we're also not, that we're planning for the potential need that we have way more cars than we thought we would. And maybe we won't, maybe we'll have less. That would be a great solution.
So we'll obviously discuss parking a little bit more.
Yeah, I was just advocating that. I'm just advocating just to a possibility of decreasing the parking minimum. That's not at all forcing the developer to create their developments without parking. I don't think a developer would even engage in a project in which they already know their target demographic is not going to be able to park their cars because there's no spaces there. It just gives them the ability to do so if there is a market to do so. Also, I think we're taking a couple leaps of assumptions to assume that everyone that is going to be moving into these places definitely has a car, that they're going to have that multiple people moving in to share a room, to share rent, but they both have cars to go to work. I think that we should do a little bit more, maybe some data study to know the demographics in this area and how they get to work. Do they work from home? Do they walk to work? Do they drive? How far are they driving? How far away is their place of work? Do we know that? Things like that. No, but your concerns are they're very valid. Do we really want to increase the vehicle load in the area? Where are they going to park? That's a very, very valid concern. I just think that there is a number out there, and we should try to optimize for this balance of parking requirements and available parking in town.
Yeah, I guess, Jim, you can provide us with some more information on that to think about. I think, again, the
Absolutely.
nature of our recommendation, I would think, would be, more to the town council to take another look at this with some thoughts that we might have on that, so, okay.
So this one, frontage, these are some of the things that I brought forward. I don't know how much we want to get into it, but 80% primary build out in the DMS, so that length of building again. My recommendation, if we're interested in looking at it, would maybe to lower that requirement slightly to, we could take a closer look at it, but something like 60 or 70%.
Jim, let me ask you a quick question on that. Would there be access behind the buildings, between the buildings?
Right. So this is
parking,
just
yeah.
model example. Parking is required to be behind the building, so the access would be behind the building most of the time. Doesn't prohibit access between the building. Let's say, for instance, an application that just came in for the Independence Park. It actually is two. They have two access points, but one is between the buildings. But it exists today. So they were building up to essentially where that driveway was going to be. Then they had a second building on the other side of it, so it ended up being between. We do have in our zoning, if you want to create a new curb cut, that's a special permit as well. So we're trying to limit the amount of turning movements, So,
Being this is walkable Main Street, there'll be a
Exactly.
problem with
Exactly.
pedestrians, okay.
Yep. So the other one being the fenestration percentage again. So that's the first floor, 60%, windows, doors, Main Street only, primary frontage, so basically Main Street and Barnstable Road. And so, it really does prioritize the commercial uses on the first floor, which probably is the intent there. But if we wanted different options, we should maybe think about that. This one, obviously, we touched on quite a bit, the roofline build-out. think the design guidelines, and maybe at the next meeting I can come with the proposed design guidelines for that to give you guys some insight into that. Really, I think will help with that character along the vertical edge there. And then tightening those district boundaries again, I think we could have a real good conversation about maybe stepping down and looking a little more closely at those boundary lines and seeing how we want to see those developed. And, you know, when we did the zoning, I know that those zoning lines themselves, the different colors, reflect the zones that were there previously. So the last iteration had downtown Hyannis instead of downtown Main Street. The purple was zoned as something, the yellow was zoned as something. And so maybe we need to take a more nuanced look at some of these other the districts, particularly downtown Village, and see if we want to tighten those a little bit. And then, of course, I don't know if we want to get to this subsequently, but year-round residential restrictions and short-term rentals certainly are a topic that has been brought up. That's what I got.
Thanks, Jim. That's great. So I guess my thought would be that when we get more of the committee here, hopefully the next meeting, we can get into a little bit more of these. So ask people, I know Cynthia will include the presentation in our minutes or even separately as a separate document that people can take a look at between now and our next meeting and give some more thought to some specific things you want to think about or ask Jim about. And Jim, if there's a few areas there, you can give us some more information on parking and the downtown, the roof lines and things like that, anything you can supplement those with. So I guess we need to think a little bit about what our next meeting would be. We tentatively set it for October 18th, which would be 2 weeks from today. I know there were a few people who had some issues with that date. So I guess I'll start by asking, is there any thought? We've been doing them on Fridays generally because that seems to work for most people. I thought about maybe talking to Cynthia and maybe we could do a doodle poll with a few dates that might include days other than a Friday. For example, maybe Monday, October 21st or Tuesday, October 22nd. I don't know right now if those look possible for the people that are here, but the thought being maybe we do a doodle poll and ask the full committee and see if we can set a date that we could get all or most everybody here. Any thoughts to begin with how the 21st or 22nd looked? Okay, so the 22nd. Yep, okay.
How about the Friday the 25th instead of the 18th?
I'm going to be out of town
Okay.
the 24th and 25th. That's the problem with the
Okay.
25th.
I can do the 21st. James?
Yeah, sorry. I'm booked on the 21st. Apologies.
I can do the 22nd.
But you could do something other than downtown zoning, perhaps, if you like.
Let's see.
We wouldn't have a quorum on the 18th.
I'm not sure. How does the 18th look for everybody here?
Yeah, I'm good.
18th? John, you'd be the only one that couldn't? Maybe we, should we keep, well, okay, we'll keep the 18th then?
Sure.
Okay, we'll stick with the 18th. Okay, we'll just stick with the 18th then. And then on the 18th, we can take a look at November. Jim, the 18th still work for you?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right, then we'll, that was easy enough. We'll leave it at the 18th. So I think the next item is just to approve the minutes of the September 20th meeting. Motion to approve?
So moved.
Second it?
Second.
All in favor? All right. Then we'll say the 18th. We need then is a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All in favor? Great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, members of the audience, for sticking around.
Cool.